Okay. Hi, everybody. Thank you for coming to World IA Day. This is amazing. It's a big room, but it's hard to tell just how many people actually are here and have registered. It's like, what, several hundred people registered for, and then you're talking about this replicated over the world. It's pretty amazing. So I just want to say, because I didn't help at all with this, actually, and I'm only benefiting from the excellence of the other people who did. So thank you to everybody who put this together. All right. So just like Peter said, I'm going to solve all the problems about information architecture and context and everything. No, I'm not. Actually, it's a big, hairy, messy, confusing thing. I'm actually working on a book for O'Reilly right now about this, and about context design is sort of a working title, Information as Architecture. It's a little philosophical for O'Reilly. They keep asking me, so where are the methods? I'm like, but it's coming together. It's a huge topic, and I'm really trying to kind of, cut a hole through the middle of it through some key pieces. And even that is pretty long. So today I'm only going to hit a few highlights that hopefully will kind of continue this architectural theme. First, I'm going to focus on this. So information architecture as expressed in this sort of polarberry web explosion of it, incarnation over the last 15 years or whatever. As a part of that, there have been this sort of round and round conversations around, well, what is it? What is it? What is it? And back when some folks started the Information Architecture Institute, and I'll claim a partial responsibility for this, we were like, well, we have to put some stuff up there that says what it is. And we have to not only put up there what we think it is, but also some stuff that I think is practical, because part of the reason for launching the Institute was to be practical, to have practical stuff that can help businesses and clients and whoever understand what this is. So it used to be that the art and science of organizing, labeling websites, blah, 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 was actually the first one that was listed in this, and then the structural design of shared information environments was kind of tucked in after. And everybody glommed onto the web thing because that's a concrete thing that they understand. And this information environment thing, they're like, well, I don't really know what you mean there, but, good on you. But for like a decade, we've been trying to figure out, well, what do we mean when we say that? So this is a big part of what I've been trying to figure out. What do we mean when we say information environment? Also, we have lots of methods, tools, processes. We have lots of things that are very well thought out, a lot of them borrowed from disciplines that started way longer before the web, or before this, even the Wurman coining of information architecture in the 70s. And these are wonderful tools and wonderful things, but a lot of them only kind of go so deep in terms of what they mean to us, right? So we know, okay, well, if you want to figure out how to do, how to cluster things together, how to cluster labels together, go do a card sort, and here's different kind of card sorts and the kind of things you can get out of that. Okay, great. So card sort is kind of this thing that I feed stuff into and stuff comes out, and I can use this now to make a website. And that's honestly how we tend to use that. We don't I have yet to see an explanation as to how cognitively or whatever else that actually works, right? Taxonomies. Well, we know that that's a thing that we do to try to organize stuff, and it tends to work. So a lot of this stuff we do is like the way that doctors give us antidepressants. The science doesn't necessarily understand how they work. I mean, they know how the chemicals move around, and they know that these behaviors result sometimes, but they can't necessarily still understand or explain, like, what are all what's really happening there. So what is underneath all this that makes all this stuff work? Well, we've been really busy helping people make stuff not be such a freaking mess, right? So we don't have haven't had a lot of time to figure some of these things out, frankly. The thing is, though, that world that a lot of this discipline was sort of born in is like child's play compared to what we're dealing with now. This is a highly structured, curated, sort of complex information environment at the Natural History Museum in New York City. If you go into this one room, there's essentially, this is where taxonomy meets taxidermy, basically. There's like all these sea creatures mounted to the wall. It's not just one of those little things. There's a bunch of those too. But it's like, massive to tiny creatures mounted on this wall. And then underneath it, there are these kiosks, and there are all these posters and things. And it's a very beautifully constructed, curated, right, sort of choreographed environment. And this is my daughter kind of tucked in, there. She's a lot older. She's 17 now, for goodness sakes. But like there she is interacting with the kiosk, and all this stuff is connected. All the labels are connected. This is a rich information environment. But it's in a bubble. It's in this little protected bubble of a museum. Well, the thing is that the things that are happening here are now everywhere. We're expecting these kinds of things just to work everywhere, but they're not choreographed, curated. They're part of the wild sort of jungle of the world out there. And they're very emergent. And it's very hard to get our hands around them. But people are asking us to. So this highly controlled version, this is really a highly controlled kind of microcosm of the world we now live in. It's just that what we have outside is more emergent, it's messier, and it's even more pervasively connected and digitally enabled at this point. So a lot of what sort of a Trojan horse that I've been using to get into understanding information architecture better is the issue of context. So I can't help but bring this image up every time I talk about context. So even if you've seen it 6 times by now, I apologize, but hey, it's a urinal and it's awesome. Do you recognize this? Anybody recognize this work of artifacture? So this was named by art experts as the most influential work of art of the 20th century. Not the prettiest, the most influential. Not because of its beauty, but because it signaled and partly catalyzed a rift in how we think about culture, about art, about everything else. I'm not going to go on about that. But it was, Duchamp basically did this by taking a urinal, turning it on its side where it wasn't even useful anymore, and adding context to it. He labeled it with a made-up name of an artist and a date. And there are all kinds of semiotical things we could talk about like how that works, which are fascinating. But basically, I just want to point out the fact that context, in this sense, just with a label, right, back in the early 20th century, essentially hacked reality. It changed culture. It changed, Warhol comes out of this. This is the beginning of Dadaism and all these other things that sort of started breaking down the sort of cultural barriers that we had between the profane and the chain of being that we believed in terms of the profane versus the heavenly. The arts were heavenly, and where we let go of our waste is like the opposite. And it was a huge taboo that he broke by doing this. He actually submitted it to an art show that was run by a board that he was on. And anyway, it's a great story. I love that story because for a long time, the 20th century, honestly, I think has been a big, the intellectual history of the 20th century has largely been about context, even though it hasn't necessarily had a lot of books called that. Just not long ago, about a year ago now, as I was agreeing to write this book, John Seeley Brown, who I really respect and whose book, The Social Life of Information, was one of the first things I read as I started working in this field long ago, before I read any of the other like IA stuff. And he tweeted this, and I was like, oh my God, this is great. And I've tried to get him to tell me whether he was quoting somebody at a conference or what. And I don't think he keeps up with his things on Twitter, so he hasn't said anything. If anybody knows him, let me know, and I need to ask him. But context is something we constantly underplay. With today's tools, we can now create content or context almost as easily as content. I'd say almost more easily. And in fact, we've been doing it all along, which is part of what I'll be getting to. Peter talked about William Gibson, the writer who coined the term cyberspace. That's a whole other interesting topic in terms of what cyberspace has turned into and what he thinks of cyberspace as being. But just not long ago, he tweeted that context or the convenient lack of it is everything. And it's true. So, but I'm partly pointing this out to say this is kind of like getting into the zeitgeist. People are thinking about this a lot lately. And I think it's because of these pervasive informational quandaries that are being caused, the decontextualization of human life, largely, in part because of what digital systems are now doing for us. Information changes how we experience the physical world. If you look at this photo, you'll notice, it's an old photo, so there's no internet involved in this photo, right? But there's information all over the place. This is all semantic information. And we'll be talking in a minute about a sort of model that talks about what I mean by that. But the lines on the road signs, signs on buildings, advertisements, these are all critical parts of cities, and they have been for millennia. Civilization is in part what it is because of the semantic information that we were able to create in our physical built environments. In fact, you don't even have to build walls to have a city necessarily, but you got to have signs. You got to have language. You've got to have stuff that everybody agrees. This is this, and this is that, and this is the way you go for this and that. This is where you poop, and this is where you eat. Right? I mean, civilization depends on these things. But now digital systems are a big part of all that stuff in our lives. The stuff that we just take for granted. This is a picture I took a year ago in Dublin, and I just looked around and realized, my God, I grew up in a world where signs stayed where they were. they said one thing, and unless it was a billboard that somebody repainted or whatever, or repapered. But now, signs, they'll say whatever. There's this sort of fluidity. But that in itself is a decontextualizing element, because this object that used to be equated with the thing that was written on it is now no longer that. Today, driving around, I may not need as many signs because now there's all this other information that I can just sort of pipe in to the thing I'm driving, or the glasses I'm wearing, or what have you. And really, it begs the question to some degree. I know I'm not using that term correctly, but forgive me. But it makes us ask, well, which road am I driving on? I mean, how many of you use a GPS now and have been for maybe a year? Okay. Have you tried driving without it recently? Was it painful? I mean, whatever tiny part of my brain was able to navigate places before is now atrophied beyond all recognition. I have to have something helping me now at all times. Now my GPS is what I even look at to know what speed I'm going. I don't even pay attention to my dashboard anymore. It's crazy. Because there I have the juxtaposition of speed limit and my speed, right? It's much more useful. It's more direct. It gives me context that I need. So I'm not saying this is all bad. There are a lot of amazing contextual things that digital systems are giving us. But I'm still not convinced that we really understand what the hell's going on, right? I don't think that we know. We're just throwing stuff at ourselves. And there's not a lot of principles or keystones underneath all that. This is, I think, Volkswagen or something, and experimenting with this augmented reality sort of version of GPS. This would scare the hell out of me if I got in a car and this was going on. But hey, it's going to happen probably, something like this maybe. I don't know. We'll see. But I do think it's fascinating because, in a sense, this is almost unnecessary because, honestly, we're already piecing this together just by sort of mashing. You know how, you'd be like, my beets got into my peas and my mashed potatoes. I don't want to eat anymore, Mom. Your mom's like, when it gets into your stomach, it's all going to be mashed together anyway, right? Well, this is really how the world is to us. It all gets mashed together anyway, even though we sort of draw these artificial lines of demarcation between the things in our world. They all sort of come together, and we'll talk about that in a minute, about cognition and stuff. So this is the famous Magritte painting. It says that this is not a pipe in French. And, certainly it shows a pipe, but it's not a real pipe you can smoke, right? Information makes places, kind of like this picture makes a pipe, except you could smoke the pipe. Okay? In other words, information and place making are intertwingled in a way that makes it so that there's not that clean separation between representation and instantiation. This, you may recognize this. Yeah, thank you. It's a dungeon. I couldn't find one of my old dungeons, but I used to spend hours drawing things like this. And maybe this is the bug that now gets me into this IA thing. But this, it's a homemade dungeon, right, for Dungeons & Dragons. It's an information environment, and it's only barely part of the physical world. It's just a paper surface with some graphite on it. Okay? That's all it is. But I'd spend hours with my friends because all we had was that, a couple of books of rules, because we never really got all the books. We just sort of made them up, and some dice. And the rest of it is all just this sort of shared narrative environment that we were in together. Right? But it wasn't a static narrative. It was a dynamic narrative within the constraints of certain informational constructions. This is not that different from what we do with information architecture. It's basically the same thing. Some immersive information and frameworks aren't physical at all, right? So, in essence, the U.S. Constitution is a framework for living together. It's a system. It's just words on a freaking page. That's all it is. It's an agreement that we share with language. But it's central to our existence. In this country and in other places, their documents have a similar role when in stable governments. But then we get online, and weird stuff starts happening. Because essentially, we're living in these digital publics that are legislated by engineers and the whims of whoever wants to change the code. So you've got a situation like Facebook Beacon where, your girlfriend might find out that you bought something for this other person because it announced it on your newsfeed and you didn't really know that it did that. Or Google Buzz, where this Gizmodo article was about, where somebody was complaining about the fact that, hey, what the heck, Google? You did this thing where you assumed that everybody I've ever emailed is a friend who I want to see all this other stuff about me. Google actually got in a lot of hot water with the government about this. They're on like a 20-year observation or something because of this thing. So, of course, Google goes, oh, well, we need to make a new thing, this Google Plus thing, and we're going to make darn sure everybody understands the context of everything they do at all times. And hats off to them. They're really trying, and I think they're doing as good of a job as they can to some degree. But the problem is it hard? It's hard. It's like really hard to have all these contextual things going on where it's just language and like lines on a screen, where you don't have the benefit of all the other rich contextual information of the physical environment. So again, going back to well, why? Why is it hard? What are the principles underneath all this? And I've talked about this before, but there's a huge difference between I can go over in the corner and have a private conversation, or I can stand on the stage and talk to all these people. You guys out there look exactly like that crowd, by the way. Just going to point that out. On Twitter, if I do D versus at, and we'll look at that in a minute as to maybe why this happens, but, just a character makes that difference, right? These are not small things that are sort of like peripheral to human life. These are major issues where politicians have lost their jobs because of mistakes like this. So the thing is that we've always lived in language, but now we also live in software, which is sort of like language that's made into this sort of pervasive machinery. The map really has become the territory in this sense. I mean, we're all living in dungeons now, basically. The thing is that we always have been, because language has always brought structure into our lives, which we'll touch on in a second. So what I'm getting to really is the fact that there is a lot of talk right now, and especially in ubiquitous and pervasive computing circles and in design circles and in mobile design circles, about existing contexts and how my phone, for example, can know, well, I'm in this hall, so don't ring right now because I'm up speaking as opposed to, somewhere else. Or it knows that blah, blah, blah. Or I'm in a coffee shop and the coffee shop recognizes me, etc. But I'm also talking about, and these certainly overlap, but I'm talking about the context that we design, because we do create context all the time. And when we introduce new things into context, we change them. So understanding the principles behind that are important. So the more we're actually, the more we do that, the more we're actually designing all of human context. Because as we saw before, it's becoming, these things that we make are becoming so pervasive in everyday life all the time in these very passive sort of infrastructural ways. So what we make for the screen changes the world outside the screen, and it's actually turning the world into the screen. And I don't think we really understand what we've made. Okay, so this is all preamble to saying, well, okay, so I'm taking a stab. I'm not an academic, I'm a practitioner, I've got some academic background, but not in this stuff. So, I'm just trying to piece together ideas from all the stuff I can read and figure out and trying to simplify it as much as I can. So here's a deceptively simple model for context, which is an agent, and it's a term that I've borrowed from the literature about cognition and things like that, trying to understand a subject within some kind of a situation. Pretty much every definition of context talks about these elements just with different words. But it's really about the cognitive understanding, comprehension of the relationship of a thing within a thing that it is nested in. Now, I said deceptively simple because, look, it can start to get a little weird. A lot of the time, those of us who are making digital systems are really concerned about the user and as agent, or the user agent. And the agent is often the subject. Well, what am I in this context, right? Am I a shopper? Am I a converser? Am I a manager of something? Am I what role is this? You know, what's the nature of the place I'm in, and how does that change what I can do or I can accomplish or who I am, right? I'm this on LinkedIn, I'm this on Facebook, I'm this on Twitter. You know, what am I? And again, it used to be that we would think of those things as, oh, those are silly peripheral social networks. Yeah, those are fun, whatever, kids do that. I think we all know better now, right? I think we all know now that these have become central infrastructures for social life. And not just social life like hanging out, but like the way we communicate with each other all day long, all the time. At work, play, church, family, whatever. Did I mention it was deceptively simple? Because then it really starts to get weird, because everything can be a subject, everything can be a lot of different people can be agents, and systems can be agents too. But rather than starting with the system and trying to figure out, oh, how can this smart AI, how can Siri be a better agent for your context? How can we even do that until we understand the way humans comprehend context? And I've yet to see anything about this in much of the literature. In a lot of the practitioner talk about this stuff is what I'm trying to say. There's a lot of literature about that question, but very little of it among practitioners. I think partly it's because as a community of practice, we're still stuck in some old ways of thinking that I'll talk about in a second. Peter talked about pace layers, and so this is what I'm saying is, rather than starting with information technology or even information science, which I think is what a lot of people assume, that, oh, well, yeah, I've read academic articles, I know all the theory, I understand the information science. Folks, that's way up the ladder on this pace layer. That's a very rarefied construction out of language, written language, which is a much more recent thing for humans than, way more recent, probably by like 1 million years than spoken language, depending on which, school of thought you read, but anywhere from, hundreds of thousands to maybe even a couple million. So this is what I'm saying is, let's start here. Let's start with what is perception, what is cognition, how does this stuff work? And because contextual understanding involves perception and cognition, perception of and cognition about information. So one of the things, one of the subtexts here is that I'm rejecting the whole data, information, knowledge, wisdom hierarchy. I think it's BS. I don't believe it anymore. And we'll see a little bit more maybe about why I think that is. I think that it's a limiting understanding of how the role that information plays in our lives. And I think it's, anyway, I'm ranting, and I'll stop and I'll stick to my script. Okay. Water, that made it better. So there's a long history of people trying to define information. There's a lot of great work out there on this. Nobody's really figured it out. Spoiler alert. There's no single definition of information. There's a lot of useful models and useful ways of thinking about it. A gentleman right on this campus long ago named Claude Shannon, who later, after he left this campus, said, hey, we're going to decide that information means this very specific thing. And we'll talk some about that in a minute. It's digital information. And that's where a lot of information science stuff comes from. But I'm not going to start there. I'm going to start somewhere else. But anyway, one thing I just want to point out is I'm not a big fan of definitions for things like this anymore. I'm really more about descriptions. And descriptions are great because they free us up to have more than one dimension to something. You don't have to have just the one true facet, right? You can have multiple ways of seeing a thing. So to me, in terms of, and these aren't the only 3 modes that I think information ever works in, but these are the 3 that matter for this issue of designing context and creating context with information architecture in particular. There's ecological, which is basically the way that animals, because ecological, not ecological in the sense of taking care of the environment, which is sort of what it's sort of come to mean colloquially, but ecological in the more original sense of the relationship of creature to environment, okay? The natural environment or whatever environment. So animals, including people, perceiving the environment and living in the environment. Then there's semantic information, which is about people communicating with people. I mean, we kind of do it to communicate with animals and stuff too, but we didn't necessarily start it that way. It was because people communicating with people. Now, this involves the whole world of semiotics and signifiers and all that stuff in terms of, so it's not just text, it's also like graphics, but in speech and all those things. And then there's digital information, right? But digital information, in the Shannon sense, was invented for machines to talk to machines. Now, not just for their own sake, just so they can go have fun all by themselves and leave us out of the party. It was so that we could use them to transmit things in a much less lossy way, with less noise. You can understand a signal across the Atlantic, for example, during a war. It was a very important question to figure out as part of cryptography and communication, radio communication, and things like that. And then it got turned into like, well, if you can do this, then you can also make these machines that kind of like think to themselves a little bit. They can sort of, you can create symbolic logic within them, and then they can sort of have an agency of their own. I won't go too far down that path, but I'm just saying that's kind of where it went. So let's start with ecological. So this is the one that is, I think, most alien, this way of thinking of information to our practice. This is not ecological information. This is mainstream cognitive science thinking, or it's a picture representing it. And I don't mean for it to look silly, like I'm not trying to make fun. I mean, this is the picture that was in a very important book in human-computer interaction. Stuart Card and some other people who sort of did this founding book. And it was based on the idea, frankly, influenced by the Shannon idea of information and the idea of computation. Because the mid-20th century, mid to late 20th century idea of computation strongly influenced the way that people understand the way our bodies work and the way our brains work. And so we started modeling our science about cognition on computation. And we're still thinking that way. You may not realize it, but you're very strongly thinking that way. And that's in part because it's taking for granted a lot of stuff that started with Descartes and the Greeks, and it's stuff that's been in culture for a long, long time. This mind-body separation, the idea that we walk around with like Platonic forms or representational images or logical constructs in our brains, and that those are what we use our bodies are just sort of these dumb terminals in a way that just sort of take stuff in, and then our amazing magical brains process it, and then with all of their wisdom, then tell our stupid bodies what then to go do. This is wrong. It's just wrong. I believe it's wrong. I'm not going to even qualify it. It's just wrong. And I'm convinced of that in part because of all the stuff I've been reading about embodied cognition. Anybody familiar now with embodied cognitive studies? Okay, so only a few hands went up, so that's great. I've got converts now. I'm preaching it. So these are all good books. I would start with Beyond the Brain by Louise Barrett. It's the most recent out of all this, and it's got the most science out of a lot of that stuff. Some people hear embodied cognition and they think Lakoff and Johnson, but that was mostly sort of philosophy and linguistics. And honestly, even Paul Durish's work, which I definitely recommend, it's amazing, but he bases a lot of his thinking on phenomenology, which dovetails with the more scientific stuff, but it's more about thought experiments, and it's less about empirical evidence. I got really into, even though I was a philosophy major long ago, I realized, no, I trust the science stuff more than the other. But the other does a great job of explaining some of it, so they work together nicely. Anyway, there are a lot of different threads of thought in embodied cognitive studies, and you'll see people talk about embodied cognition who are actually mainstream cognitive science folks. But what they do is they've appropriated pieces of it that kind of fit. But the way I think of that is like back in Copernicus' time when astronomers were like, we see that now that we've got a better telescope, that this thing does this weird curlicue, so we have to build that into our model. We have to keep making our model weirder and weirder to try to explain the stuff that we actually see. And Copernicus is like, no, it's actually pretty simple if you just get over this whole Earth, the center of the universe thing. Can you do that? And they're like, no, obviously the moon. Okay, yeah, fine. Your theory explains the moon. Congratulations. the universe is bigger than that, right? Or Newtonian physics. It's great for pool, if you're playing pool in a perfect vacuum. It's awesome. But it turns out it doesn't explain everything, right? So this is, I think, just it's a way for us to expand, but it requires throwing away some sacred cows, or killing them, I think is what we typically do. But anyway, I don't know. Anyway, throwing some ideas out. This is a guy, James J. Gibson. Anybody heard of James J. Gibson? J.J. Gibson, they call him in the writings. Okay, so I had never heard of this guy before. I even started writing this book, and I had a section in it that was going to be called information. I was like, yeah, I'll get to that. I'll figure something out about something to say about information. Started really digging into it, and in the embodied cognition stuff, and asking around, people were like, well, if you want to understand information in an embodied way, go read Gibson. So this book is expensive, the one on top there, but it's one of the most wonderful things I have ever read. It is a delight to read just because his voice is so wonderful and fresh. And what this guy did was he started off in World War II as he had a PhD in psychological or experimental psychology, whatever. And he was put to work trying to figure out how pilots cognitively deal with flight. And important question. And he realized that, hey, all these kind of very ancient Cartesian ideas about how we think about space and place and all that are just wrong. They're getting us in trouble. If we design planes like that, it's not going to work very well. There are a lot of workarounds pilots are having to do in order to deal with that. And he got so fascinated with it that he spent like a 50-year career dealing with perception. So he didn't really talk about cognition that much, because this whole embodied and one embodied cognition person, Tony Chamorro, wrote a book called Radical Embodied Cognition, and to me, that's the aim that I'm trying to take with this, is to say, no, it's sort of a radical point of view. And Gibson was actually a contemporary of Shannon's, and he was aware of Shannon's work. But he basically says in the book, like, look, Shannon is using the word information in a sort of rarefied way. And at that point, it was still sort of new. You know, at the time he was thinking some of these things. He used this word in this rarefied way in order to deal with, you know, inputs and outputs of machines and stuff. That's fine, but let's set that aside. I mean information in this way. It would take a week-long seminar to really get into all this, so I'm just going to hit very, very high-level stuff. But he developed something called information pickup theory, which is basically that, and this, by the way, ends up squaring very well with embodied cognitive stuff and phenomenology, which says that we don't understand our environment by just sitting here and observing it as a sort of disembodied, still observer. That we evolved in an environment where we move. Even if you were strapped to the wall, like, Alex in Clockwork Orange, strapped to a chair with your eyes open, you're still moving enough to get a sense of depth and all this other stuff. Like, it's movement that we use. It's action. We perceive by acting, and we act because we perceive. Okay? And the environment and us are in this sort of symbiotic relationship. We evolved in an environment. We are the shape we are because of the environment we're in. Our brains work the way they do because of the environment that we evolved in, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So this perception action loop he says that what we're doing is we're picking up our perceptual systems. He doesn't say eyes, he doesn't say brain, because he says it's all one big nested sort of like intermingled system. You can't really take one thing out of it and talk about it all by itself. You can focus on certain areas, but you have to think of it as a system. Our perceptual system picks up cues of structure through the differences in the energy arrays in our environment. So for vision, it's light. And he mainly focused on vision because it's such a huge thing. It's like, well, I got to focus somewhere. But he does apply this across all the sort of perceptual systems. And anyway, so this perception action loop and this idea of looping has become important with embodied cognition studies because it talks about how, like, well, yeah, sure, some of our loops are very internal. Like, we'll just think through some things like in our heads, so to speak, but we're still using things that the root system of which come from our interaction with the physical world, with our bodies. You can't have a brain in a vat. It wouldn't know anything. It just wouldn't. I mean, it might after you took it out of somebody who had grown up in the physical world, but that would be the only way, and it would probably forget it pretty quickly. If you've ever tried to go and do some physical thing that you used to do when you were like in high school, and you realize, oh man, I forgot how to do this. My body forgot how to do this, right? It makes a difference. So here's a few key ideas from Gibson's theories. One is this idea of information pickup. It's perception of the evidence of structural variation in surfaces and substances. When you read them, you start realizing that a lot of this stuff sounds almost caveman-y, like very primitive thinking. It's just very simple concepts about like objects that move or don't, or objects that are attached or not attached. Things that change are an event, blah, blah, blah. It seems awfully simple. But that's because it is. Because the cornerstones of the way we perceive our world are that. They're pretty basic. It's just the way they get combined into all this emergent complexity that makes us these wacky creatures called humans. We perceive the environment in human scale terms, not scientific abstractions, right? So we don't, this is perception. I'm not talking about thinking or communicating with each other. I'm talking about initial like perception of our environment. That we perceive the environment in terms of what it means to our bodies. Like something is about as long as my arm, or something is tall enough for me to walk under, right? Once you start getting out to things that are too small for us to really perceive or too big for us to perceive in that way, then you start getting into scientific nomenclatures and having to explain things like $1 billion is like, you know, a dollar lined up 1 billion times. You know, like you have to explain these things, and you can try to explain all these things. It's like, oh, it wraps around the world 6 times. Now I understand it. No, you don't really. I mean, it's a fun image, but you don't really get that. Okay, so we perceive environment as nested, not logical hierarchy. This is really important for information architecture, by the way, because we're so given to strict logical hierarchies, but that's thinking that comes out of the digital thinking, right? The digital engineering-y kind of like information science thinking. But people don't necessarily understand their world that way because really that's very situated. So this one thing may be really important to me and kind of foregrounded and kind of contain this other thing, but then when my situation changes or my needs change, suddenly like the priorities are very different. You know, I might get into a cave and think, oh, this is great. Now I'm inside somewhere. But then I realize that it's actually, once it starts raining, that it's very leaky, and it's like now I feel like I'm outside again. My environment's nestedness it can be somewhat fluid. Although we do perceive elements in the environment as invariant or variant. This is another key issue. In digital spaces, things can just kind of be whatever. You know, when they started Second Life, the game that now nobody talks about, but I think it's still kind of an interesting case study in a lot of ways. When they started Second Life, when they first conceived of it, the idea was, well, let's just have this sort of like big abstract kind of environment where you can just make whatever. You know, and they started realizing that people couldn't comprehend it. They had to have ground, they had to have sky, and they had to have bodies. Otherwise, people just couldn't even get their heads around what to do. And I think there was an important lesson in terms of, you know, so to bring up a practical example finally, I guess, would be this idea of content everywhere, right? Well, we can just put content anywhere, everywhere. Well, the problem is language doesn't make any sense without context. And so you can't just have it anywhere. You've got to determine what are the structural contexts in which, now they can be dynamic, they can have rules behind them, but you've got to have some idea of what is variant or persistent in the environment. Not necessarily permanent. Permanence, like over a millennium, is not a bodily perceptual thing. Like, I don't know about that. But I do know that tree that was there when I was a kid is still there, right? But that flower that was there for a week is now dead. So that's an invariant. But it is, that's more of a variant, right? But what's invariant is the principle that, when I see flowers, they grow for a while and then they tend to die. That's an invariant. So this variance and variance thing is a really important principle that I think is very applicable. All these things are incredibly applicable to what we do. We just don't have time to really get into them in a lot of detail here. You've heard of this term, affordance, I assume. Okay, well, Gibson invented this. In the book he says, I wish I had the quote in front of me, it's great. Basically saying, this word doesn't really exist this way yet, I'm making it exist. And then he goes on to explain it with all these ecological sort of perceptual things. What's funny is that Don Norman then later on takes that and kind of borrows it because it was the one, and I'm quoting Norman, I'm paraphrasing Norman when I say this, it was the one thing out of all the stuff that Gibson talked about that he understood. No, he says this. This is why he's now rewriting stuff and saying, forget about affordances, let's talk about signifiers. I think that's wrong because, feel free to tell him, I think that's wrong because signifiers are much further up on that pace layer thing, right? That's more about how language works. It's not really about how perception works. It plays into it, but it's not bedrock. So anyway, he talks about affordance as sort of this sort of rubric for all this stuff about perceiving the ability for my body to do something in my environment. And perception really only exists insofar as we perceive affordances. That's a much broader statement than, can you put an affordance here? Right? It's a very different way of thinking about what affordance is, which I think changes not just IA but interaction design, which is a whole other amazing way to think about this stuff that, again, I'll show an example in a minute if I can get through all this. I'm running out of time very quickly. In fact, I'm going to rush through some stuff because I'm realizing how late it is. I'm sorry. So if you think about the fact that our bodies are not these sort of automatons that do what they do regardless of the nature around us, but instead it's more the opposite. It's more like a weather vane is positioned the way it is because of the environment it's in, or the Watt steam governor, the way it works. These are examples that are brought up in the literature a lot. The Watt steam governor works because the little balls, you've probably seen these in movies from depicting things in the 1800s. So the little balls there kind of go up as it spins faster, right? But then that helps to govern its momentum because as it spins faster, the weight naturally makes it have to, equalize and calibrate itself. This is really how our perceptual systems, our bodies, ourselves, basically, I didn't mean to say that like that book, but you know what I mean. This is how we are in our environments. I've learned a lot of this by having, this is my first indoor dog, Sigmund. He wasn't born this way though. This is a costume. But he does have hypnosis laser eyes, which is amazing. I didn't know Boston Terriers could do that. But Sigmund is great. He's almost 2. His birthday's coming up soon. And I'd never had an indoor dog before really growing up. So this has been a real experience for me learning all this. And the fact that he lives in a different world than I do to some degree. Dogs live in the same world more than a lot of other animals do, which is why we dig dogs so much because they're kind of evolved that way to glom onto us like that. But I'll be walking him and he'll just stop, like the ground just grabbed him. And what's the deal, dude? What's the problem? And if I let him, I'll find out. Either there's a shadow that he's not sure what it is, or he smells something and he's I don't smell that thing he smells, but he's interested in it because in his world, that's important. That's the way that's the way he evolved, was for those parts of the environment to be important to him. I've been learning a lot about watching him and going, my God, this is so true, all this stuff. Asimo, Honda's little robot, is so cute, but it's built based on the sort of Cartesian cognitive science model that you've got a dumb body, no matter how adorable, that has this really, really smart brain that just takes inputs and outputs, right? But there's a famous video where it tries to go upstairs, and there was just this microscopic problem, and it just tumbled all over the place. This is not a pretty robot. It's not cute, but it's called Big Dog. And what's amazing about it is that it's just in the form of its body that it does most of its thinking. And I put thinking in quotation marks, right? But it deals with the environment around it through really rugged, weird terrain very competently. I mean, gracefully even. It's bizarre. We don't have time to watch the video, but look it up. And in this video, you can't even kick this thing over, right? It just, boom, 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 like a ballet dancer. Not that you kick ballet dancers usually, but you know what I mean. But it goes through the woods, right? And there are other things where you see it going through the woods, and it's oh my God, Asimo could never, ever do that. So it's been an example that's been brought up a lot in body cognitive studies. Okay, so I spent a lot of time on that because that's the newest bit, I think, maybe to our group here. It was newest to me. Semantic information, I think, is really an environment that humans have created. We're adding to environment, right? So language is not information. Language is environment. You're hearing my voice. I'm making the air do things, and it's making your ear do things, right? This is language, but it's really just I'm adding stuff to the environment that you have learned to interpret as affording information for, these higher level cognitive things. That's all language. When you're sitting and thinking to yourself right now about the stuff I'm saying, you're thinking in terms of language. This is an amazing ability that humans have. No matter how good gorillas get at sign language and stuff, they'll never. It's far and away. It's light years difference. So there was this weird emergent quirk that happened to our species that pushed us in this direction to the point where some theorists say that it actually affected our evolution. That we are the species who are in part because of our use of language. I don't mean written language. That's been around a lot less long. There's more I could say about that, but I won't. But Andy Clark, in Supersizing the Mind, writes about this, saying that language is like a form of mind-transforming cognitive scaffolding. It's this persisting, though never quite stationary, symbolic edifice. It plays a critical role in promoting thought and reason. He also talks about how language is a sort of augmented reality trick that we emerged with as a species. Most of what we do is in this realm. We're thinking a lot, like the ecological perception stuff. That has a lot to do with the way that I know how to get out of this room. So the built environment, architecture, definitely gets a lot of that. The wayfinding work that was done by Pacini and those guys. It's interesting to read that work now because when I read it, I see that they're struggling. They're seeing people interact with their environment in these sort of almost intuitive sort of gut level ways. But they're trying to interpret it in the sense of the cognitive science that they've learned in the mid-20th century. And there's sort of this tension. I don't think they knew there was a tension, but it seems there is to me. So contextual clarity requires structure, even a joke like this, that one morning I shot an elephant in my pajamas. How we got into my pajamas, I'll never know. The trick of that joke comes out of the fact that there's a structural component in that sentence that makes it tricky, right? And language brings structure into the world. So here's a door. So Don Norman talks a lot about doors in Design of Everyday Things, right? Well, this is a door that at an office supply place or so. No, it was a sporting goods store, I think, that I was at a few months ago, and. It's a perfect example of that whole, do I push, do I pull, right? Well, it turns out you could not push this door. But because it was glass, and I was with my daughter and my wife, so we were walking in, and because it was glass, I could already see through the door and already saw the area of the store that knew I needed to go to. I completely ignored this pull thing, partly because, well, for one thing, only the last two letters are different from the word push. Let's put it that way. But it's also it's the same color as the door. Right, it kind of blended in. There were a lot of ecological things going on where, so one of the things I write about in this thing is the loop of least resistance. Basically, the cognitive loop that I was sort of depending on was the ecological thing, because the semantic thing takes more work. Right, I'd have to stop and kind of cognitively think, pull. Oh, I'm supposed to pull. Now my daughter, because she wasn't the first one, she said, oh, well, I saw it said pull. I was wondering why you're trying to push it, right? But she was perceiving it in a slightly different way. But these are all critical issues in terms of the way that we design stuff. So if you look at this, for example, this is an email system I used to use, Zimbra, a place I used to work. And, when you're in a hurry, it's really easy to click the wrong red X. I'm telling you. Even the one that's inverted, the red X rather than the white within red, it's really easy to hit delete rather than decline, or decline rather than close. That's a mess. Now, semantically, it's pretty clear. As an engineering headspace, we'll look at this and go, well, it's clear that this is within this box. That's a different context from that box and that box. Don't you parse that? No, I don't, because I'm in a hurry and I'm grabbing at the physical objects before I really think that much about what they mean semantically. Similar issue here. This was my wife was trying to get out of the Fab spam fest, and fab.com or whatever it is, and so she goes and she finds herself clicking on this damn red button, thinking that it's a confirmation button because it's a big red button. I'm supposed to click big red buttons, right? How many of you have tested people and gone, why are you clicking that button? It says right below it, you're not supposed to click it yet, and they do it anyway. It's a big button. That's a berry. I'm hungry. I want my berry. I want to move on. right? That's what we're doing. You think you're real sophisticated, you're not so sophisticated. I'm just going to say. So the whole tweet thing, okay, I've got 30 seconds left. The whole tweet thing, this is part of the reason why this goes down, is because Twitter started off as an SMS service. And so, you know, if you've got your direct messages set up to where they ping your SMS thing, it's awfully easy to post straight to Twitter because it's the same address, right? Just to post publicly. So the thing is, you know, here's my SMS interface. Here's my Twitter direct message interface. They feel like the same place, right? But they do very different things. One is a corner conversation, and the other is, hey, everybody that follows me on Twitter, here's something I have to say. So there's digital, which I'm not going to spend a lot of time on, but basically digital information is sort of the black box computer-to-computer whisperings that are not meant for human contact. We experience them in their effects in the other modes, but it does leak its way in, right? So we're seeing, like, I love this, I went up to a gas pump. Enter data. Enter data. And they had to put a sign, a little more semantic glossing, right? A little. It's like reading the Talmud, like, and it's like, oh, well, here's some rabbi wrote on the side. Well, what Yahweh really means here is, you know, so what the God of digital, you know, information means is this is your zip code. Or, for example, now I did this. I don't normally have this on my Twitter profile, but I did it just as an example because a lot of people do this, and I just think this is interesting. Like, yeah, my iPhone can say these are your coordinates. This is not human information. This is a Cartesian grid that I don't walk around with an ecological understanding of. This delta thing, all that stuff below is for me, but that thing up there, that's for a machine, right? I think it's fascinating to see these now all around, how, like, we can sort of see our machines murmuring to one another. Part of our job is to figure out where should that be translated, where should it not be shown, or where does it need to be shown with a lot of explanation because otherwise it's hidden from us and we don't know what's going on. This is a situation where the digital necessities of the because this is not all disembodied stuff either. Digital stuff requires plumbing. It requires hardware. These two systems are very separate systems, even though both of them are using the term account. Okay, so they have to disambiguate when I go to this website to pay for my khakis or whatever the hell I'm paying for. At Tug, we've got this little diagram which looks like some kind of Wiccan thing, but it's really getting at the fact that, you know, a lot of us like jump right into taxonomy, and the truth is that most books written about information architecture don't mention ontology. And I didn't used to care about it, but now I really do. Because now I'm realizing you can't have, your taxonomy isn't necessarily going to make any sense unless you think about ontology. And ontology gets at the center of what is the thing, right? What is the nature of it? Then you can figure out, okay, well, what language we wrap around that? And how is that structured? But the word ontology is used in these two different spheres. And one is the philosophical sphere, which is older, which is the nature of being and what we are. And the other is, please describe a formal enter data, right? So a lot of, I think, what we do is bridging these things. Otherwise, we get into situations where you've got a word like friend being, I can't resist using this slide almost every time I talk. You use this word like friend in this very sort of like sledgehammery way, like a place like Facebook, where everybody's a friend, right? Everybody. And that gets us into trouble. Or Google Buzz got in trouble because they just sort of threw everybody into one. It was efficient. It was a very clean database, just to say one entity, friend. But hey, guess what? Our lives are more complicated than that. How do we bridge that? At Lowe's, they've got this, for a long time, they had a Lowe's card where you could buy things at Lowe's with a credit card called a Lowe's card. But then they all rolled out this thing called My Lowe's, where you also have a My Lowe's card. Well, why is My on it? So it's totally different. You go up to register and you're like, do they have your Lowe's card? Yeah, I'm paying with it. Well, no, I mean your My Lowe's card. You have one too? Like it becomes like a who's on first routine, right? Language matters. Language isn't just a label we slap on something. But turns out that's the way most places build stuff. They build stuff starting with the engineering, and then hey, marketing, could you come up with some cool labels to put on this stuff? Right? Totally backwards, because the world we live in isn't the digital one, it's the language one. And this whole idea of like, I'm shopping on an online store, but I'm also shopping in a real store. These contexts, how do they connect? What do they have to do with each other? Why do you need this information from me? So there's all this disambiguation that has to go on, and understanding and this literacy that's building where people realize, oh, well, Amazon maybe is a different kind of place than Lowe's.com. And then you've got these things where, like, Tesco has this, and I'm almost done, I promise. Tesco has this wall of food, store in a Subway, where now you're not just in a Subway. You're also in a Tesco store. And you've got these little QR codes, but you have to have the literacy to understand what those are. And look at all of the ecological simulacra that has to go on in order to give any kind of semantic meaning to that weird little whisper that the computers make to one another, right? All the work that goes on to sort of like make people feel like and understand, they could have just as easily just had a freaking list of stuff. Detergent, rice, whatever, and then a QR code. But this is more effective because it brings all this other ecological and human-made semantic information into the mix. So basically, information architecture, I think, uses labels. I think we tend to talk about labels like they're like this little add-on thing, but they're really the center of our lives. And the connections between them. And then also, something we often overlook is that the rule sets that control all the dynamic behavior and meaning of which doors are open and which windows are open and when is this building a place for play, and when is it a place for work. Because in the physical world, those things are kind of stuck the way they are most of the time. But in the digital world, we actually have to decide. We have to decide what is the nature of this place is, because you can change them like that. And that's basically it. I'm done. Thank you for indulging my extraness.